Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the lives of the people who shaped the biblical world. I'm Biblical Mystery, and I'll be your guide as we explore another remarkable story hidden within the pages of Scripture. In today's video, we're uncovering the complete story of Ebed-Melech. At first glance, Ebed-Melech seems like a minor figure, a man mentioned only briefly during one of the darkest moments in the history of Jerusalem. Yet this foreign servant would do something that many kings, priests, and powerful leaders failed to do. While an entire nation ignored God's warning, Ebed-Melech chose courage over silence. While others abandoned the prophet Jeremiah to die, he risked his own position and possibly even his life to save him. But who exactly was Ebed-Melech? Why did God single him out for a personal promise of deliverance when Jerusalem itself was about to fall? And what can the actions of one overlooked man teach us about faith, courage, and standing for what is right when everyone else chooses the safer path? As we follow his story from the royal court of Judah to the collapse of Jerusalem itself, you may discover that some of the greatest heroes in the Bible are not always the ones whose names appear most often. Before we begin, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. If there is an important detail you believe deserves further discussion, we would love to hear your perspective. Now, let's step back into the final days of the Kingdom of Judah and discover the complete story of Ebed-Melech. History tends to remember kings, conquerors, prophets, and famous leaders. Their names appear in records, their decisions shape nations, and their stories are retold for generations. Yet sometimes the most important person in a critical moment is someone who stands quietly in the background until circumstances suddenly pull them into the center of events. Ebed-Melech is one of those people. His name appears only briefly in the Book of Jeremiah. Compared to the major figures surrounding him, he seems almost insignificant. Entire chapters are devoted to kings. Prophets dominate the narrative. Military campaigns alter the course of history. Against such a backdrop, Ebed-Melech occupies only a handful of verses. At first glance, he appears to be a minor character whose role could easily be overlooked. But appearances can be deceptive. There are moments in history when the actions of a single individual create consequences far greater than anyone could have anticipated. The story of Ebed-Melech unfolds during one of the most dangerous periods in the history of ancient Judah. The nation was approaching a crisis that would permanently change its future. Political leaders struggled to maintain control. Fear spread through Jerusalem. Uncertainty shaped every major decision. In the middle of this growing turmoil stood the prophet Jeremiah, a man whose warnings had made him one of the most controversial figures in the kingdom. Many people opposed him. Powerful officials viewed him as a threat. Others wanted his voice removed entirely. As tensions escalated, Jeremiah would eventually find himself facing a situation from which he could not escape alone. His survival would depend upon someone willing to intervene when others chose not to. That person was Ebed-Melech. One of the reasons his story remains so compelling is that the biblical text provides very little information about him before the events that made him famous. We are not introduced to years of accomplishments. We do not receive a detailed biography. Scripture simply places him into the narrative at precisely the moment his presence becomes necessary. This creates an unusual effect. Readers discover Ebed-Melech in much the same way history often discovers real heroes. They are not always the individuals everyone expects. They do not always possess the greatest influence. Sometimes they emerge only when circumstances demand a choice that reveals who they truly are. The value of Ebed-Melech's story extends beyond the events themselves. His account invites a deeper question about how courage is recognized and remembered. Most societies celebrate visible achievements. Victories receive monuments. Powerful leaders receive recognition. Yet, many of the most meaningful acts occur away from public attention. They happen when an individual decides that remaining passive is no longer acceptable. Such moments rarely attract immediate praise, but they often reveal character more clearly than years of success. That reality sits at the heart of Ebed-Melech's story. What makes his actions even more remarkable is the environment in which they occurred. He was not living during a period of peace and stability. The kingdom around him was moving toward disaster. Fear influenced political decisions. Survival dominated public concerns. Under such conditions, people often become more cautious, more protective of their own interests, and less willing to take risks on behalf of others. Yet, the circumstances that discourage courage are often the same circumstances that reveal it. As the events surrounding Jeremiah unfolded, Ebed-Melech would soon face a decision carrying real consequences. He could remain silent and protect himself, or he could act on behalf of a man abandoned by some of the most powerful figures in Jerusalem. The choice may appear obvious when viewed from a distance of thousands of years. It was far less obvious to someone living through the uncertainty of that moment. The significance of his decision becomes even clearer when viewed within the larger story of Judah's final years. The kingdom stood at a crossroads. Leaders debated competing visions of the future. Some believed they could still avoid catastrophe. Others refused to acknowledge how serious the situation had become. Meanwhile, events beyond Jerusalem's walls continued moving forward with relentless momentum. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic chapters in biblical history. Before we can fully understand why Ebed-Melech's actions mattered, however, we must first understand the world in which those actions took place. The story begins not with the man himself, but with a city standing on the edge of collapse, unaware that its final chapter was already beginning to unfold. By the time Ebed-Melech entered the biblical record, Jerusalem was no longer the confident capital it had once been. From a distance, the city still possessed many of the symbols that had defined it for generations. The temple still stood upon Mount Zion. The royal government still functioned. The walls remained in place. Daily life continued as people moved through streets, markets, and public spaces, yet, beneath that appearance of normality, the kingdom was experiencing a slow and irreversible unraveling. The crisis facing Jerusalem did not emerge overnight. It was the result of decades of political instability, shifting international power, failed leadership, and spiritual decline. To understand why the city eventually reached such a desperate state, we must look beyond Jerusalem itself and examine the larger world that surrounded it. The ancient Near East was undergoing a dramatic transformation. For centuries, the Assyrian Empire had dominated the region through military strength and political control. Entire nations adjusted their policies according to Assyrian interests. Then, surprisingly quickly by historical standards, that empire collapsed. The power vacuum left behind created opportunities for new kingdoms to rise. Among them was Babylon, under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II. Babylon expanded rapidly and established itself as the dominant force in the region. Cities that once looked elsewhere for protection now found themselves facing a new imperial power with enormous military resources and little patience for rebellion. Judah was one of the smaller kingdoms caught within this changing landscape. Geographically positioned between larger powers, it often found itself navigating difficult political realities. Leaders were forced to make decisions about alliances, loyalty, and survival. Some believed cooperation with Babylon offered the safest path. Others hoped resistance could preserve independence. These debates became increasingly important as Babylon tightened its control over neighboring territories. Unfortunately for Judah, several political decisions placed the kingdom on a dangerous course. Attempts to challenge Babylonian authority repeatedly ended in failure. Each act of resistance weakened the nation further and invited stronger responses from Nebuchadnezzar. By the time Zedekiah occupied the throne, Judah was no longer dealing with a distant threat. The kingdom was confronting an empire that had already demonstrated both its strength and its willingness to punish disobedience. Zedekiah inherited a situation for which there were no easy solutions. Historical sources and the biblical account portray him as a ruler caught between competing pressures. Powerful advisors pushed different agendas. Foreign threats demanded immediate attention. Public expectations remained high, despite increasingly difficult circumstances. The king's challenge was not simply choosing a policy. It was deciding which voices deserved to be trusted during a period when nearly everyone claimed to possess the answer. This uncertainty spread far beyond the palace. Ordinary citizens also felt the weight of the crisis. Families worried about the future. Soldiers prepared for conflict. Merchants faced economic disruption. Every sector of society experienced the effects of growing instability. Then came the siege. Ancient warfare often relied on patience rather than speed. Instead of immediately storming fortified cities, armies frequently surrounded them and restricted access to food, trade routes, agricultural resources, and outside support. Over time, shortages developed. Anxiety increased. What began as a military strategy gradually became a psychological weapon. The longer a siege continued, the more pressure accumulated inside the city. Jerusalem found itself trapped within exactly this kind of situation. The population lived under constant uncertainty, unsure how long resources would last or whether relief would ever arrive. Yet, one of the most fascinating aspects of this period is that many people still believed disaster could somehow be avoided. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to hope, even when circumstances grow increasingly bleak. Sometimes that hope is justified. Sometimes it becomes a barrier, preventing honest evaluation of reality. In Jerusalem, confidence persisted despite mounting evidence that the kingdom's position was deteriorating. Some trusted political solutions. Others looked to military resistance. Many assumed the city would ultimately be spared because of its unique religious significance. The presence of the temple reinforced the belief that Jerusalem occupied a protected place in history. This conviction shaped the thinking of countless individuals, including some who struggled to imagine the possibility of defeat. The result was a city divided not merely by politics, but by competing interpretations of what was actually happening. One group believed the nation could still secure its future through determination and resistance. Another voice insisted that the crisis had deeper causes that could not be solved through military or diplomatic means alone. That voice belonged to Jeremiah. For years, he had warned that Judah's problems extended beyond foreign policy. According to his message, the kingdom faced consequences rooted in a much longer history of disobedience and misplaced priorities. Such warnings became increasingly controversial as conditions worsened. People under pressure often search for reassurance. Jeremiah offered something different. He challenged assumptions that many desperately wanted to preserve. This growing tension would soon place him on a collision course with influential figures inside Jerusalem. As the siege tightened and uncertainty deepened, the struggle over the city's future became inseparable from the struggle over whose interpretation of reality would prevail. The stage was now set for a conflict that extended beyond armies and politics. At its center stood a prophet carrying an unwelcome message, leaders determined to maintain control, and a city approaching the most decisive moment in its history. Every major crisis produces competing voices. Some offer reassurance, others promise quick solutions. A few challenge assumptions that people would rather keep unquestioned. In the final years of Judah, Jeremiah belonged firmly to the last category. By the time Jerusalem came under Babylonian siege,
He had spent decades delivering messages that consistently placed him at odds with political leaders, influential figures, and large portions of the population. His ministry began long before the kingdom reached its final crisis, yet the themes he proclaimed remained remarkably consistent throughout his life. He warned that Judah's relationship with God could not be separated from its future as a nation. While many people focused on military threats and political alliances, Jeremiah repeatedly pointed toward deeper issues that he believed lay beneath the surface of the kingdom's troubles. One reason Jeremiah became such a controversial figure was that his message challenged comforting assumptions. Many citizens of Jerusalem believed their city occupied a uniquely protected position. The temple stood at the center of national life. The kingdom traced its history back to David. Religious traditions reinforced the conviction that Jerusalem's survival was virtually guaranteed. Jeremiah confronted this confidence directly. He argued that sacred institutions could not function as automatic protection against the consequences of persistent disobedience. Such statements were deeply unsettling because they challenged ideas many people had accepted for generations. Yet Jeremiah's unpopularity cannot be explained merely by theological disagreement. His message became even more difficult to accept because it intersected with the political realities of his time. As Babylon grew stronger and Judah's situation became increasingly precarious, people naturally searched for reasons to remain hopeful. Optimistic predictions gained attention. Messages promising deliverance found eager audiences. Jeremiah, however, refused to alter his warnings in order to make them more appealing. He insisted that the kingdom was moving toward judgment, and that ignoring reality would only make the eventual outcome worse. This refusal placed him in direct conflict with individuals who believed maintaining confidence was essential for national survival. The disagreement was not simply about facts. It was about competing interpretations of what faithfulness required. Many of Jeremiah's opponents likely saw themselves as defenders of the nation. They believed resistance against Babylon demonstrated courage. They viewed perseverance as a patriotic duty. From their perspective, Jeremiah's warnings threatened morale at the very moment unity seemed most necessary. What made the situation especially complicated was that Jeremiah was not advocating surrender because he admired Babylon or wished harm upon his people. According to the biblical account, he believed Babylon's rise formed part of a larger divine judgment that could not be prevented through conventional political means. This distinction is crucial for understanding the conflict. Jeremiah's message was theological before it was political, yet its political implications were impossible to ignore. As conditions deteriorated, opposition to Jeremiah intensified. The Book of Jeremiah records numerous episodes illustrating the resistance he encountered. He faced ridicule, threats, imprisonment, and public hostility. These experiences reveal how threatening an unwelcome message can become when it challenges powerful interests. The issue was no longer whether people agreed with Jeremiah. The issue was whether they were willing to tolerate his continued presence. Every time he spoke, he reminded listeners of realities they preferred not to confront. Every fulfilled warning increased pressure on those who had dismissed him. Every passing year made it harder to ignore the possibility that he had been right all along. Yet, perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Jeremiah's ministry was his motivation. Modern readers sometimes imagine him as a stern figure announcing judgment without emotion. The biblical text presents a far more complex picture. Jeremiah is often called the weeping prophet because his warnings were accompanied by profound grief. He mourned the suffering he foresaw. He lamented the condition of his people. He did not celebrate the prospect of Jerusalem's downfall. He feared it. His message was not driven by hostility toward Judah, but by concern for its future. This tension gives the story much of its emotional weight. The man accused of undermining the nation cared deeply about the nation he was accused of harming. By the final stages of the siege, however, patience with Jeremiah was rapidly disappearing. Influential officials had reached a point where they no longer viewed him merely as an irritating critic. They saw him as a problem requiring a solution. The distinction is important because it marks a dangerous shift. Societies can tolerate disagreement for long periods. Trouble begins when those in positions of power decide that opposing voices should no longer be allowed to speak. Jerusalem was approaching exactly that moment. The pressure created by war, fear, uncertainty, and political desperation was transforming opposition into something more aggressive. The city stood at a crossroads. Babylon surrounded the walls. The population struggled beneath the strain of the siege. Leaders searched for ways to preserve control. Meanwhile, Jeremiah continued delivering the same message he had proclaimed for years. He would not change it to satisfy public opinion. He would not soften it to protect himself. He would not abandon it to gain favor with powerful men. That determination ultimately made him one of the most isolated figures in Jerusalem. It also set the stage for the events that followed. The question facing the city's leadership was no longer whether Jeremiah's words were welcome. The question was what they intended to do about the man who refused to stop speaking them. Their answer would soon place the prophet in mortal danger and create the circumstances that finally brought Ebed-Melech into the center of the story. Up to this point, Ebed-Melech has remained largely in the background of the story. Jerusalem is under siege. Jeremiah is becoming increasingly isolated, and political tensions continue to rise throughout the city. Before the crisis reaches its turning point, however, it is worth pausing to examine what the biblical text actually tells us about the man who would soon play such an important role. One of the challenges in studying Ebed-Melech is that Scripture provides only a limited amount of information about him. Modern readers often want detailed biographies, personal histories, and extensive background information. The ancient text offers none of these. Instead, it gives a few carefully chosen details that allow us to understand why his appearance in the narrative would have attracted attention from its original audience. The first detail concerns his identity. Jeremiah describes him as a Cushite. In the ancient world, Cush referred to a region located south of Egypt, generally associated with the area of Nubia and parts of present-day Sudan. Far from being an obscure territory, Cush possessed a long and impressive history. Powerful kingdoms emerged there centuries before the events described in Jeremiah. Archaeological discoveries have revealed sophisticated cities, monumental architecture, trade networks, and royal dynasties that interacted with neighboring civilizations across northeastern Africa and the Near East. At various points in history, Cushite rulers even exercised influence over Egypt itself. This background matters because it reminds us that Ebed-Melech came from a region with its own cultural identity and historical significance. He was not introduced merely as a generic foreigner. He was identified with a recognizable people, whose presence was known throughout the wider world of the ancient Near East. The second detail concerns his position within Jerusalem. The text places him in the king's house, indicating some form of service connected to the royal administration. Many English translations refer to him as a eunuch, while others use broader expressions such as official or court servant. The variation exists because the Hebrew term can function in more than one way. In some contexts, it clearly refers to a eunuch. In others, it serves as a title associated with royal service, regardless of physical status. Because the passage offers no additional explanation, scholars remain cautious about making definitive claims. What can be said with confidence is that Ebed-Melech occupied a position that provided access to important areas of government and eventually allowed him to approach King Zedekiah directly. Such access suggests a degree of trust and responsibility within the royal household. These details also reveal something interesting about life in ancient Jerusalem. Modern readers sometimes imagine biblical kingdoms as culturally isolated societies, but the historical reality was often more complex. Trade routes connected distant regions. Diplomatic relationships crossed national boundaries. Royal courts frequently included individuals from different backgrounds who served in administrative, military, or diplomatic capacities. Ebed-Melech's presence in Jerusalem, therefore, reflects broader patterns visible throughout the ancient world. People moved. Ideas traveled. Political systems incorporated individuals whose origins extended beyond local borders. Yet, while his background helps explain who he was, it does not explain why he stands out. The answer lies elsewhere. Many foreign officials served ancient kings. Very few became remembered within Scripture. Ebed-Melech's significance emerges not from where he came from, but from the choices he would eventually make. In fact, one of the most striking aspects of the story is that the biblical account shows little interest in turning his ethnicity into the central point. The text mentions his Cushite identity, then quickly shifts attention toward his actions. This emphasis is important. Ancient readers would certainly have noticed his background, but they were ultimately being invited to evaluate his character. The narrative consistently directs attention toward what he does rather than where he came from. This creates a subtle contrast with the larger situation unfolding in Jerusalem. The city was filled with influential individuals who possessed every possible advantage. They understood the traditions of Judah. They occupied positions of authority. They belonged to the established structures of society. Yet, many of those same individuals would soon fail a crucial moral test. Ebed-Melech, by contrast, would respond very differently. The contrast is not presented as a criticism of an entire nation or as praise of one ethnic group over another. Rather, it reflects a recurring biblical theme. Character cannot be assumed on the basis of status, ancestry, education, or proximity to power. The qualities that matter most often become visible only when circumstances force a difficult decision. Another intriguing aspect of Ebed-Melech's story involves the mystery that still surrounds him. We do not know how long he had lived in Judah. We do not know what experiences shaped his worldview. We do not know what he thought of Jeremiah before the events recorded in chapter 38. The silence of the text leaves many questions unanswered. Yet, perhaps that silence serves a purpose. By withholding unnecessary details, the narrative keeps attention focused on the moment that mattered most. Readers are not distracted by an extensive backstory. Instead, they are prepared to observe how one man responds when confronted with a clear choice between convenience and conviction. At this stage, Ebed-Melech remains a respected but relatively minor figure, moving through the corridors of a government under immense strain. Outside the city walls, Babylon continues its siege. Inside the city, fear and frustration are steadily increasing. Jeremiah continues delivering warnings that many leaders no longer wish to hear. The atmosphere is becoming more volatile with each passing day. Soon, a group of powerful officials will decide that criticism is no longer enough. They will move against the prophet directly. Their actions will place Jeremiah in immediate danger and create the defining moment of Ebed-Melech's life. When that moment arrives, readers will discover that the most important thing about him is not where he came from or what title he held, but what he was willing to do when confronted with injustice. The conflict between Jeremiah and Jerusalem's leadership had been building for years, but every long struggle eventually reaches a point where disagreement turns into action. By the time Jeremiah chapter 38 begins, the city was enduring the brutal realities of a prolonged Babylonian siege. Food was becoming scarce. Anxiety was spreading through the population. Confidence in the future was steadily eroding. Under these conditions, patience for unwelcome messages was disappearing. The officials surrounding King Zedekiah no longer viewed Jeremiah as merely a troublesome voice. In their eyes, he had become a threat to the city's ability to survive. The immediate trigger for the crisis was Jeremiah's continued proclamation that those who remained in Jerusalem would face destruction, while those who surrendered to Babylon would preserve their lives. To modern readers, the statement may appear to be a practical prediction based on military realities. To many officials living through the siege, it sounded dangerously subversive. They believed the city needed determination, resistance, and unity. Jeremiah's message challenged all three. Every time he spoke, he undermined the narrative that victory remained possible. Every warning he delivered encouraged people to question the strategy being pursued by the leadership. Whether his critics agreed with his theology or not, they increasingly viewed his influence as politically dangerous. The officials, therefore, approached King Zedekiah with a request. According to the biblical account, they argued that Jeremiah should be put to death because he was discouraging the soldiers who remained in the city and weakening the morale of the people. This accusation reveals an important shift. Earlier, opposition focused largely on rejecting Jeremiah's message. Now, the discussion centered on removing the messenger himself. The distinction matters because it marks the moment when debate gave way to suppression. Rather than proving Jeremiah wrong, his opponents sought to ensure that fewer people could hear him at all. The king's response was revealing. Instead of defending Jeremiah or carefully evaluating the accusation, Zedekiah effectively surrendered the matter to the officials. He admitted that the prophet was in their hands and acknowledged his inability to oppose them. The statement exposed a recurring weakness that had followed the king throughout much of his reign. Again and again, he found himself caught between competing pressures. He listened to Jeremiah. He listened to his advisors. Yet, when decisive leadership was required, he often yielded to whichever force appeared strongest in the moment. His decision here would have serious consequences. With royal approval secured, the officials moved quickly. Yet, they did not carry out a public execution. Instead, they chose a method that would allow Jeremiah to disappear from the center of public life, while avoiding the appearance of formally putting him to death. They took him to a cistern belonging to Malchiah, a member of the royal family. To appreciate the significance of this act, it is useful to understand what a cistern was. Ancient Jerusalem relied heavily on systems designed to collect and store water. Large underground reservoirs were carved into rock and used to capture rainwater during wetter seasons. Some remained filled, others stood empty, except for layers of mud and sediment that accumulated over time. These structures were essential for urban survival, particularly during sieges when access to outside water sources could be restricted. Jeremiah was lowered into one of these abandoned reservoirs. The text specifically notes that there was no water inside, only mud. As he descended, he sank into the mire. The image is both physically and symbolically powerful. The prophet, who had spent decades warning his nation, now found himself trapped beneath the city he had tried to save. He was not placed in an ordinary prison cell. He was abandoned in a location where survival became increasingly unlikely with each passing day. Darkness surrounded him. Escape was impossible. Time itself became an enemy. Historical realities make the scene even more disturbing. A person confined in such conditions would face exhaustion, exposure, dehydration, and eventually starvation. The officials may not have announced an execution, but the practical outcome was obvious. Left alone in the cistern, Jeremiah would die. The method allowed responsibility to be obscured while producing the same result as a death sentence. In many ways, it represented a form of silent elimination. This episode also reveals something deeper about the psychology of power during times of crisis. Leaders facing immense pressure often become tempted to treat criticism as the problem, rather than the conditions that generated the criticism. Jeremiah's warnings were uncomfortable because they forced people to confront realities they preferred to avoid. Removing him offered the illusion of solving that discomfort. Yet, silencing a warning does not remove the danger that inspired it. The officials succeeded in isolating the prophet, but they could not change the circumstances surrounding Jerusalem. Babylon remained outside the walls. Food shortages continued. The city's future remained uncertain. Reality itself was unaffected by their decision. Equally striking is the absence of meaningful resistance. The biblical account records no organized effort to defend Jeremiah. No influential coalition emerges on his behalf. No powerful leader publicly objects. The prophet's suffering unfolds within a broader atmosphere of silence. Such silence often becomes one of the most revealing elements in stories of injustice. Wrongdoing rarely survives through the actions of a few individuals alone. It frequently depends upon the unwillingness of others to intervene. Some remain quiet because they agree. Others remain quiet because they fear consequences. Still others convince themselves that involvement would make no difference. Whatever the reason, silence creates space in which injustice can operate. Jeremiah now sat alone in the pit, abandoned by most of the people who possessed the authority to help him. Yet one person would not remain silent. Somewhere within the royal administration, news of what had happened reached a man who viewed the situation differently. He was neither king nor prince. He had not participated in the decision. He possessed far less influence than the officials responsible for Jeremiah's imprisonment. Nevertheless, he recognized something that many others had chosen to ignore. A grave wrong had been committed. The moment had arrived when observing events from a distance was no longer enough. Very soon, Ebed-Melech would step out of the background of the story and confront the moral test that would define his legacy for generations to come. Jeremiah's enemies had achieved what they wanted. The prophet was no longer standing in public places delivering unwelcome warnings. He was no longer speaking directly to soldiers, citizens, or officials. Hidden inside a muddy cistern beneath the city, he had effectively been removed from public life. For the men responsible, the problem appeared solved. Yet, history often turns on moments that seem insignificant at first. While influential officials believed the matter was settled, another figure inside Jerusalem was preparing to make a decision that would alter the outcome entirely. That figure was Ebed-Melech. The biblical account introduces his response with remarkable simplicity. He learned what had happened to Jeremiah and immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. This detail may seem obvious to modern readers, but it highlights an important reality. Many people already knew the prophet had been imprisoned. The difference was not information. The difference was interpretation. Some viewed Jeremiah's fate as justified. Others likely considered it unfortunate, but unavoidable. Ebed-Melech saw something else. He saw an act of injustice unfolding in real time. More importantly, he understood that waiting would only make the situation worse. Every hour Jeremiah remained in the cistern reduced the chances of survival. The crisis demanded action, not discussion. At this point, Ebed-Melech faced a dilemma familiar throughout history. He could remain silent and protect his own position, or he could become involved in a conflict created by far more powerful men. Neither option was without consequences. Silence offered safety. Intervention carried risk. Modern readers often encounter biblical heroes after already knowing the outcome of their stories. That perspective can make courageous decisions seem easier than they actually were. Ebed-Melech did not know how events would unfold. He did not know whether the king would listen. He did not know whether the officials who opposed Jeremiah would retaliate. He only knew that a man had been left to die, and that doing nothing would make him complicit in the result. Understanding the political environment makes his decision even more impressive. Jerusalem was under siege. Fear shaped public life. Leaders were struggling to maintain authority. In such circumstances, questioning the actions of influential officials could easily be interpreted as disloyalty. People tend to become more cautious during periods of instability because mistakes carry greater consequences. Careers can be destroyed. Reputations can collapse. Personal safety can disappear quickly. Ebed-Melech had every practical reason to stay out of the matter. Yet, the biblical account suggests that moral conviction outweighed personal calculation. Rather than avoiding the issue, he took the most direct route available. He approached King Zedekiah himself. The location of the encounter adds another layer to the story. The king was sitting at the Benjamin Gate, a place associated with public and administrative activity. This was not a private conversation hidden behind palace walls. Ebed-Melech brought his concern directly before the highest authority in the kingdom. Such a step required more than compassion. It required confidence that speaking was necessary regardless of the outcome. What follows is one of the most remarkable statements in the entire account. Ebed-Melech told the king that the officials had acted wickedly in what they had done to Jeremiah. Notice what he did not do. He did not speak in vague terms. He did not hide behind ambiguity. He did not attempt to soften the issue into a minor misunderstanding. He identified the situation as a moral failure. This was a bold assessment because it challenged the actions of men who possessed influence and authority. It also implicitly challenged the king, whose approval had allowed those actions to occur. Ebed-Melech was not merely requesting assistance. He was confronting a wrong. The significance of this moment extends beyond the rescue of Jeremiah. Throughout the story of Jerusalem's decline, many leaders struggled to distinguish between political convenience and moral responsibility. Ebed-Melech demonstrated a clarity that others lacked. He understood that some situations demand judgment before they demand strategy. Before asking what was politically advantageous, he recognized what was right. That distinction explains why his words carried such force. He was speaking from conviction rather than calculation. King Zedekiah's response is equally noteworthy. Throughout much of Jeremiah's ministry, the king appears hesitant and conflicted. He listens to different voices and often delays difficult decisions. Yet, on this occasion, he acted quickly. Whether moved by conscience, persuaded by Ebed-Melech's argument, or troubled by the implications of Jeremiah's situation, he issued an order that immediately changed the course of events. Ebed-Melech was instructed to take 30 men and bring Jeremiah out of the cistern before he died. The command accomplished something important beyond the rescue itself. It reversed the previous decision that had abandoned the prophet. Authority, which had been used to enable injustice, was now being used to correct it. This transition underscores a theme running quietly through the chapter. Power itself is neither moral nor immoral. Its significance depends on how it is exercised. The same governmental structure that allowed Jeremiah to be lowered into the pit also made it possible for him to be lifted out. The crucial difference was the presence of an individual willing to challenge wrongdoing and call for action. Yet, perhaps the most revealing aspect of the episode is what it teaches about courage. Courage is often imagined as fearlessness, but the biblical account suggests something more realistic. Ebed-Melech's bravery did not require certainty. It did not depend on possessing overwhelming influence. It emerged from a willingness to act despite uncertainty. He could not control the king's response. He could not guarantee success. He could not eliminate personal risk. What he could do was refuse to allow fear to determine his behavior. In that sense, the defining moment of his life occurred before Jeremiah was ever rescued. It occurred the moment he decided that remaining silent was no longer an option. The king had now granted permission. The rescue team would soon be assembled, and hope had returned to a situation that previously seemed hopeless. Yet the next stage of the story would reveal another dimension of Ebed-Melech's character. Speaking on behalf of Jeremiah had required courage. The way he carried out the rescue would reveal something equally important: his deep sense of compassion for the suffering of another human being. Obtaining the king's permission was only the beginning. Jeremiah was still trapped inside the cistern, weakened by confinement, surrounded by mud, and completely unable to free himself. A decision had been made in the royal court, but decisions alone do not save lives. Someone still had to carry out the rescue. At this point, the narrative shifts from the courage of speaking to the responsibility of acting. Many people are willing to identify a problem. Far fewer are willing to invest the effort necessary to solve it. Ebed-Melech proved willing to do both. Armed with the authority granted by King Zedekiah, he organized the mission that would bring Jeremiah back from the edge of death. The biblical text records that he took 30 men with him. The exact reason for this number remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest the larger group provided protection against possible interference from those who opposed Jeremiah. Others argue that the king simply wanted to ensure the operation would be completed efficiently and without complications. Whatever the reason, the detail reinforces an important reality. Jeremiah's rescue was not treated as a minor administrative task. It was considered urgent enough to justify a substantial response. Every moment mattered because the prophet's condition continued to deteriorate with time. Yet before heading directly to the cistern, Ebed-Melech did something unexpected. He stopped to gather old rags and worn pieces of cloth from a storage area beneath the palace treasury. At first glance, this may appear to be one of those small details that readers quickly overlook. In reality, it is one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. The Bible often communicates character through actions rather than descriptions, and this brief episode tells us a great deal about the kind of person Ebed-Melech was. He understood that rescuing Jeremiah involved more than simply pulling him out of a pit. The prophet had been trapped for an unknown period of time. He was likely exhausted, physically weakened, and vulnerable to injury. If ropes were tied directly beneath his arms and used to lift his weight from the depths of the cistern, the process could be painful and potentially dangerous. The cloths provided padding between the ropes and Jeremiah's body. This is an extraordinary detail because it reveals a level of compassion that extends beyond the immediate objective. Ebed-Melech was not merely concerned with success. He was concerned with the condition of the person being saved. This moment deserves more attention than it often receives. The book of Jeremiah contains political intrigue, prophetic warnings, national collapse, and divine judgment. Amid such dramatic events, the image of a man collecting old rags might seem insignificant. Yet, it is arguably one of the most human moments in the entire account. While others debated strategy, power, and survival, Ebed-Melech focused on the suffering of an individual. He noticed a problem that many people would never have considered. He anticipated pain before it occurred and took practical steps to reduce it. Compassion often reveals itself in exactly this way, not through grand declarations, but through thoughtful attention to the needs of others. The rescue itself must have been difficult. Ancient cisterns could be deep, narrow, and difficult to access. Jeremiah was instructed to place the cloths beneath his arms, creating a protective barrier between his body and the ropes. Once everything was prepared, the men began lifting him from the pit. The biblical account does not linger on the physical details, but it is not difficult to imagine the scene. After days of isolation in darkness and mud, The prophet slowly ascended toward daylight. What had seemed like a death sentence was being reversed. The man abandoned beneath Jerusalem was being brought back into the world above. Beyond the immediate drama, the rescue carried broader significance. Jeremiah's life mattered not simply because he was a human being in danger, though that alone would have justified intervention. His survival also mattered because his role in the unfolding story of Judah was not finished. Important events still lay ahead. Critical conversations would still take place. The final chapters of Jerusalem's history had not yet been written. Had Ebed-Melech chosen indifference, the course of the narrative itself might have been very different. Another noteworthy aspect of the episode is the absence of self-promotion. The text never portrays Ebed-Melech seeking recognition for what he accomplished. He does not celebrate his courage. He does not demand rewards. He does not attempt to elevate his status within the royal administration. In many historical accounts, individuals who perform significant deeds quickly become the focus of attention. Here, the spotlight remains fixed on the rescue itself. This quiet humility makes the story even more compelling. Ebed-Melech acts because he believes action is necessary, not because he expects praise. The contrast between him and the officials who imprisoned Jeremiah is also becoming increasingly clear. Both groups possessed some degree of influence. Both had access to authority. Both made decisions affecting the life of another person. Yet they used their influence in opposite ways. One group employed power to silence and isolate. The other used power to protect and restore. The difference was not merely institutional. It was moral. The same environment produced entirely different responses depending on the character of the individuals involved. By the end of the rescue, Jeremiah had been removed from immediate danger and placed in the court of the guard. He was still living within a city under siege, but he was no longer abandoned in a place where death seemed inevitable. For the first time in days, hope had replaced despair. Yet the significance of this chapter extends beyond Jeremiah's survival. Through a series of practical decisions, Ebed-Melech revealed qualities that had only been hinted at earlier in the story. Courage had brought him before the king. Compassion shaped the rescue itself. Wisdom guided the details. Humility governed his conduct afterward. Together, these qualities transformed a relatively unknown court official into one of the most admirable figures in the final days of Judah. Unbeknownst to him, however, the impact of his actions extended beyond the lives he could see. While Jerusalem continued moving toward destruction, God had taken notice of the man who chose mercy when others chose indifference. The next stage of the story would reveal just how significant that divine attention truly was. The rescue of Jeremiah could easily be viewed as the conclusion of Ebed-Melech's role in the story. He had recognized an injustice, confronted the king, organized a rescue mission, and preserved the life of a prophet. From a historical perspective, that alone would make his actions noteworthy. Yet the biblical account refuses to leave the story there. Instead of focusing solely on what Ebed-Melech did, it eventually reveals how God viewed what Ebed-Melech had done. This shift in perspective is one of the most important moments in the entire narrative, because it moves the discussion beyond courage, compassion, and moral responsibility into a deeper question. What was it about Ebed-Melech that caused God to single him out during one of the darkest periods in Judah's history? The answer appears in Jeremiah chapter 39. Significantly, the message comes after Jerusalem's fate had already been sealed. The city was approaching destruction. Babylon's victory was no longer a distant possibility, but an unavoidable reality. Most people in Jerusalem were focused on survival. Political structures were collapsing. Long-held assumptions were being shattered. Yet, in the middle of this national crisis, God directed a personal message toward a man who occupied no throne and commanded no army. This alone should capture the reader's attention. Throughout history, major events tend to focus attention on powerful figures. Kings dominate headlines. Generals shape military outcomes. Political leaders become the center of public discussion. The biblical text often operates differently. Again and again, it redirects attention toward individuals whose significance would be overlooked by conventional standards. Ebed-Melech belongs to that tradition. The message delivered through Jeremiah begins by reaffirming something that many people were still struggling to accept. The judgments spoken against Jerusalem would occur exactly as foretold. The city's destruction was not going to be avoided through last-minute strategies or unexpected political developments. The consequences that Jeremiah had warned about for years were now arriving. This context is crucial because it demonstrates that God's words to Ebed-Melech were not disconnected from reality. The city was still going to fall. The suffering associated with that fall would still occur. Divine favor toward one individual did not erase the broader historical events unfolding around him. Yet, within that larger story, God addressed Ebed-Melech personally. The promise itself was straightforward. He would be delivered. He would not be handed over to those he feared. His life would be spared during the chaos surrounding Jerusalem's collapse. These assurances are remarkable, but the most revealing part of the passage appears in the explanation that follows. God did not attribute Ebed-Melech's future deliverance to social status, ethnicity, intelligence, influence, or achievement. Instead, the text provides a single reason. He had put his trust in God. This statement changes the way readers understand everything that has happened so far. Up to this point, Ebed-Melech's story has largely been told through actions. We have seen him speak when others remained silent. We have seen him challenge powerful officials. We have seen him protect a vulnerable man at personal risk. Those actions revealed character. But Jeremiah, chapter 39, reveals the foundation beneath that character. According to the biblical text, trust in God stood at the center of who Ebed-Melech was. His courage was not merely a personality trait. His compassion was not simply a matter of temperament. The choices he made reflected a deeper source of confidence. This distinction matters because biblical faith is rarely presented as passive belief. In Scripture, trust becomes visible through decisions. It emerges when individuals must choose between fear and obedience, comfort and conviction, self-preservation and responsibility. Ebed-Melech's story illustrates this principle with unusual clarity. When Jeremiah was abandoned in the cistern, remaining uninvolved would have been the safer option. Speaking to the king introduced uncertainty. Opposing influential officials created risk. Organizing a rescue demanded commitment. None of these actions guaranteed success. Yet Ebed-Melech acted anyway. The message in Jeremiah chapter 39 suggests that these decisions were not isolated acts of bravery. They flowed from a deeper trust that shaped the way he viewed the world. Another important aspect of the passage is the contrast it creates between visible power and genuine security. Throughout Jerusalem, leaders invested enormous energy trying to preserve their positions, influence, and political objectives. Many believed safety could be achieved through human effort alone. Yet, as events unfolded, the limitations of those strategies became increasingly obvious. Ebed-Melech, by contrast, never appears as a central political actor. He was not directing national policy. He was not negotiating alliances. He was not commanding military operations. Nevertheless, he received something that many more powerful individuals never obtained. He received a direct assurance from God. This contrast lies at the heart of the chapter. The text is not primarily celebrating a heroic rescue. It is revealing the type of person God chooses to remember. The answer is not the most visible, the most influential, or the most successful. The answer is the one who remains faithful when circumstances create pressure to do otherwise. Ebed-Melech's significance, therefore, extends far beyond a single event involving Jeremiah. He becomes an example of how faith expresses itself through action, and how God evaluates people according to standards that often differ from those used by society. In a city filled with powerful individuals, God addressed a servant. In a period dominated by fear, God highlighted trust. In a moment when history appeared to belong to kings and empires, God drew attention to the choices of one man whose name appears only briefly in the biblical record. As Jerusalem moved closer to its final collapse, that divine evaluation would soon be tested against the harsh realities of history itself. The city was about to experience the catastrophe Jeremiah had predicted for decades, and the promise given to Ebed-Melech would stand in direct contrast to the destruction unfolding all around him. For decades, Jerusalem had lived under the illusion that its foundations were stronger than they truly were. Political leaders believed they could navigate international crises through strategy and diplomacy. Military planners trusted fortifications and resistance. Many citizens assumed the city's religious significance guaranteed its survival, regardless of the choices being made within its walls. These sources of confidence appeared solid for a time, but history has a way of exposing the difference between what seems secure and what actually is. By the year 586 BC, that moment of exposure had arrived. The siege that had strained Jerusalem for months finally reached its conclusion. Babylonian forces breached the city's defenses, and the kingdom that had endured for centuries entered its final collapse. The fall of Jerusalem stands as one of the most consequential events in the Old Testament. It marked the end of Judah's independence, the destruction of long-established institutions, and the beginning of a painful chapter that would reshape Jewish history for generations. Yet, beyond its historical significance, the event also revealed a deeper truth about the limitations of human security. Everything many people had relied upon was suddenly tested. Political calculations failed. Military resistance failed. Optimistic predictions failed. The assumptions that once inspired confidence could no longer withstand reality. The city that seemed permanent proved vulnerable. The structures that appeared stable proved fragile. What unfolded was not merely a military defeat, but the collapse of an entire framework through which many people understood their world. The biblical account describes these events with striking directness. Babylonian officials entered the city and established control. Resistance came to an end. The authority of Judah's government effectively disappeared. What remained was the painful process of dealing with the consequences. Families faced uncertainty about their future. Communities experienced displacement. Familiar patterns of life were interrupted or destroyed altogether. For those who lived through the catastrophe, the experience must have felt unimaginable only a few years earlier. One of the most dramatic examples of this collapse can be seen in the fate of King Zedekiah. Throughout the story, he appears as a ruler caught between competing pressures, often recognizing the seriousness of Jeremiah's warnings without fully committing himself to the course of action those warnings demanded. When Jerusalem finally fell, Zedekiah attempted to escape under cover of darkness. His effort failed. Babylonian forces captured him, bringing a tragic end to his reign. His downfall illustrates a recurring theme that runs throughout the final years of Judah. Delay cannot eliminate consequences indefinitely. Difficult realities postponed eventually become difficult realities confronted. Yet, while the spotlight of history often focuses on kings and battles, another perspective emerges from the biblical text. The collapse of Jerusalem was not only a story about what failed, it was also a story about what endured. As the city's institutions crumbled, one thing remained unchanged. The word spoken concerning Ebed-Melech still stood. This distinction is important because chapter 8 focused on why God remembered Ebed-Melech. Chapter 9 reveals what happened when that divine evaluation encountered historical reality. It is one thing to receive a promise before disaster arrives. It is another to witness that promise remain meaningful while disaster unfolds. The significance of Ebed-Melech's story becomes most visible against the backdrop of Jerusalem's destruction, because it highlights a striking contrast. Around him, systems that appeared powerful were collapsing. Yet the foundation upon which his life rested remained intact. Scripture does not provide extensive details regarding every aspect of Ebed-Melech's experience during the city's fall. The narrative's interest lies elsewhere. The emphasis is not on reconstructing every moment of his survival, but on demonstrating the reliability of what God had declared earlier. God had promised that Ebed-Melech would not be handed over to those he feared and that his life would be preserved. Now, the very circumstances in which such promise mattered had arrived. The city was falling. Violence and uncertainty surrounded Jerusalem. Human predictions were being tested by events. In the middle of that turmoil, the promise remained. This contrast between collapsing structures and enduring faithfulness forms the heart of the chapter. Throughout the story, different groups placed their confidence in different things. Some trusted political strategy. Others trusted military resistance. Still others trusted assumptions about national privilege that ignored the warnings Jeremiah had delivered for years. Ebed-Melech's story points in a different direction. His confidence was not tied to the survival of a government, a wall, or an institution. The biblical explanation for his preservation was simple. He trusted God. As a result, when external circumstances changed dramatically, the foundation beneath his life remained the same. This does not mean Ebed-Melech escaped every difficulty associated with Jerusalem's collapse. The biblical text never suggests that faith removes all hardship from human experience. Rather, it emphasizes that divine faithfulness remains present even when familiar forms of security disappear. That distinction is crucial. The chapter is not presenting Ebed-Melech as a man who avoided history. He lived through history. He experienced the same national catastrophe affecting everyone around him. What distinguished him was not exemption from reality, but the reliability of the promise accompanying him through that reality. Looking back, the fall of Jerusalem exposed many illusions. It revealed the limits of political power, the fragility of institutions, and the danger of ignoring uncomfortable truths. At the same time, it revealed something else. Amid the ruins of a fallen kingdom stood evidence that faithfulness had not vanished from the story. Long after strategies failed and ambitions collapsed, the words spoken concerning Ebed-Melech remained dependable. This is why his account occupies such a meaningful place within Jeremiah's narrative. His story demonstrates that while human systems inevitably rise and fall, the ultimate question is where trust is placed when those systems begin to fail. As the dust settled over Jerusalem and an era came to an end, Ebed-Melech's life stood as a quiet reminder that the most durable foundation is often the one least visible to the world. His legacy would not be defined by political achievements, military victories, or public recognition. It would be defined by the choices he made and the trust that sustained him when everything around him seemed to be coming apart. As the story of Ebed-Melech comes to a close, we are left with an unusual contrast. Throughout this journey, we have explored the final years of a kingdom, the warnings of a prophet, the failures of leaders, the advance of an empire, and the destruction of a city. These are the kinds of events that normally dominate historical memory. Yet, when readers return to the narrative centuries later, one of the most compelling figures is not a king, a general, or a political strategist. It is a man who appears only briefly, speaks very little, and steps into the spotlight for a remarkably short period of time. That reality alone tells us something important about the way Scripture evaluates significance. The Bible consistently measures people by standards that differ from those often used by societies and institutions. Ebed-Melech's story illustrates this principle with remarkable clarity. One reason his account remains so memorable is that it never depends upon extraordinary status. The text does not present him as someone born into privilege or elevated through public achievement. Readers are not asked to admire him because of his position. Instead, they are invited to observe the choices he made when confronted with a difficult moral situation. The defining moment of his life arrived when another human being was suffering, and most people either supported the injustice or remained silent. At that moment, Ebed-Melech chose responsibility over convenience. Everything that follows in the story grows out of that decision. This makes his legacy fundamentally different from the legacies that usually attract attention. Many historical reputations are built upon conquest, wealth, influence, or political success. Such accomplishments can certainly shape events, but they do not always reveal character. Ebed-Melech's significance emerges from a different source. His actions exposed who he was when there was little personal advantage to be gained. He intervened without any guarantee of reward. He accepted risk without certainty of success. He acted because he believed action was necessary. In doing so, he demonstrated a form of leadership that often receives less recognition, but frequently leaves a deeper impact. Another reason his story deserves attention is the way it connects faith with practical behavior. The biblical account never portrays trust in God as a purely private experience, detached from everyday decisions. In Ebed-Melech's case, faith became visible through action. The confidence that God later commended was already evident in the choices he made long before receiving any promise of deliverance. This sequence is important. He did not act courageously because he had been guaranteed protection. He acted first, and only later does Scripture reveal God's evaluation of his conduct. The order reinforces a recurring biblical theme. Genuine faith often becomes visible before outcomes are known. It expresses itself through obedience in moments where certainty is unavailable. His story also offers a powerful reflection on the nature of influence. Throughout the narrative, Ebed-Melech operated within a system dominated by people who possessed greater authority than he did. The officials who imprisoned Jeremiah held significant power. King Zedekiah occupied the throne. Babylon commanded vast military resources beyond the city's walls. Compared to such figures, Ebed-Melech appears relatively insignificant. Yet, when the critical moment arrived, his decision altered the course of another person's life. This reminds readers that influence cannot always be measured by titles or positions. Sometimes the most important contribution a person makes is the willingness to act when circumstances create an opportunity to do what is right. The story further challenges assumptions about where faithfulness is likely to be found. Throughout Jerusalem, many individuals possessed religious knowledge, political experience, and social standing. Yet the narrative ultimately highlights a man who stood outside many of those traditional categories. The point is not that background is unimportant. Rather, the story demonstrates that character cannot be predicted solely by external factors. Scripture repeatedly directs attention toward the heart, the choices people make, and the values they reveal under pressure. Ebed-Melech becomes one more example of this broader biblical pattern. There is also something deeply human about the details preserved in his account. Readers often remember the dramatic moments, the confrontation with the king, the rescue of Jeremiah, and the promise of deliverance. Yet, some of the most revealing elements are surprisingly ordinary. Gathering old cloths to protect an injured man, recognizing suffering that others ignored, refusing to accept that someone should be abandoned simply because powerful people had decided his fate. These actions may seem small when compared with the rise and fall of kingdoms, but they are precisely the kinds of choices through which character becomes visible. In that sense, Ebed-Melech's story remains timeless. The specific historical circumstances belong to the ancient world, but the underlying questions continue to resonate. What should a person do when confronted with injustice? How should courage be expressed when speaking carries risk? What matters most when social pressure encourages silence? These questions extend far beyond the walls of Jerusalem and the events of the 6th century BC. They speak to situations that arise in every generation. Perhaps this explains why Ebed-Melech's brief appearance continues to attract attention despite the limited information available about him. The biblical text leaves many aspects of his life unexplained, but it reveals enough to illuminate the qualities that mattered most: courage, compassion, integrity, faith. These characteristics transformed a relatively unknown court official into one of the most respected figures in Jeremiah's story. Long after the siege ended and the kingdom disappeared, those qualities remained worthy of remembrance. In the end, Ebed-Melech's legacy is not primarily about rescuing a prophet, though that achievement was certainly important. His legacy is about demonstrating what faithfulness looks like when it encounters a real-world problem. He saw a wrong, accepted the cost of involvement, and acted accordingly. Through that choice, he became part of a story far larger than himself. The walls of Jerusalem eventually fell. Political leaders came and went. Empires rose and declined. Yet the example left behind by Ebed-Melech endured. His life reminds us that history is often shaped not only by those who possess power, but also by those who possess the courage to use whatever influence they have in service of what is right.